Today we are continuing with Hunting for Hidden Gold by Franklin W. Dixon. When we last left the Hardys, they had followed Big Al, who had disappeared at the end of a canyon. Chapter 15, Underground Chase. Frank and Joe looked at each other in sheer disbelief, mingled with uneasiness. Except for the panting of their horses, not a sound broke the wintry silence of the canyon. Could Big Al have rigged some kind of ambush? Joe asked in a low, worried voice. I don't see how, Frank murmured, scanning the terrain. There's no place for him and his horse to hide. The cliff walls on either side were bare and precipitous. With the moon almost directly overhead, the snow-covered floor of the canyon was revealed with brilliant clarity. The narrow river banks were barren of brush. Aside from a few scattered rocks, none big enough to afford cover, nothing intervened between the boys and the frozen waterfall. Well, he must be here somewhere, Joe said edgily. His tracks will give us the answer. Frank agreed. The boys dismounted and moved forward cautiously, leading their horses. Moonlight wrapped the scene in an eerie loneliness. The boys kept their eyes and ears alert. Gradually, they became aware of another sound, the muted roar of falling water, still flowing behind the glacier-like formation. The sound became louder as they neared the cataract. The majestic ice curtain glittered in the moonlight. It was fringed with great, jagged blue-white spears that hung down like stalactites. I don't get it, Joe muttered. Al's tracks lead straight towards the waterfall. As they proceeded, Frank took out his flashlight and switched it on. He gave a great cry of surprise. Joe! He must have gone under the waterfall. At the base of the cliff was a dark open space yawning between the curve of the falls and the rock face. It was large enough to admit a horse and rider. Both boys moved closer for a better look, and Frank probed the darkness with his flashlight. Look! There's an opening in the cliff wall, Joe exclaimed. It must be a tunnel. Or maybe a blind cavern, Frank said, switching off his flashlight. Big Al could be waiting for us in there. After a whispered conference, Frank groped his way behind the cataract. When he reached the opening in the wall, he quickly snapped on his flashlight again for a more leisurely examination. Presently, he came back and reported to Joe. It's a tunnel, all right. No telling how far it goes, or where. No sign of Big Al? Joe questioned. Not in person, but there are wet tracks. The two horses balked a bit as the boys took their bridles and attempted to lead them into the dark space behind the icy falls. Joe's animal, which was in the lead, whinnied and reared when it felt the splattering spray, but it soon calmed down under Joe's reassuring hand. Inside the tunnel mouth, the passage widened, giving the boys room to mount. Frank and Joe rode slowly forward, with Joe in the lead, shining his flashlight. After several hundred yards, the rear passage widened, and the boys were able to ride side by side. Must have been the bed of an old underground stream, Frank guessed. See how small the walls are worn? Joe nodded. We better speed up before Big Al gets too far ahead. Urging their horses to a faster pace, they pushed on through the tunnel. At intervals, the boys stopped and listened, hoping to catch some sound of their quarry. The fourth time they halted, a faint echoing sound of horses' hooves on the rock reached their ears somewhere ahead. We must be getting closer, Joe said tensely. Just how close was difficult to judge, since the enclosed passage with its smooth, hard walls might carry the sound almost any distance. The boys rode on steadily. When they paused to listen once more, the hoofbeats were no longer audible. But 20 minutes later, Joe thought he could detect them again. He may be far ahead of us, Frank said. Sound can be tricky in here. As the brothers continued along the tunnel, the chill, dank atmosphere gradually became warmer. Frank and Joe unzipped their heavy windbreakers. After a while, it became necessary to rest the horses. The Hardys dared not pause too long for fear of losing Big Al completely, and soon went on. The tunnel turned and twisted. The horses were nervous at first, but proceeding gradually as they became accustomed to the experience. It seems as if we've been traveling for hours, Frank said. Presently, he snapped on his flashlight to glance at his wristwatch. To his amazement, it was almost 3:30 in the morning. Whew! Do you realize the night's almost over, Joe? I sure do. The horses are bushed. Gradually, the boys became aware that the tunnel was sloping upward. The horses began to pant and labor on the steepness of the incline, and the Hardys had to rest them more frequently. "It's getting colder in here," Joe said with a sudden shiver. Both boys zipped up their jackets. "We must be getting close to the surface," Frank said hopefully. Some time later, he was about to turn on his flashlight again when he paused. "Hey! The tunnel's not so dark as it used to be. Or am I imagining things?" "You're right," Joe replied, with rising excitement. "I'll keep my flashlight off for a while." Soon the boys could feel cold air on their faces. The tunnel was lightening every moment, and presently a gray glimmer of daylight showed ahead. With joyful cries of relief, Frank and Joe urged their horses forward. In a minute or so, they had emerged from the tunnel into a snow-covered mountainside. Rocks, scattered trees, and slopes all around them were bathed in the ghostly light of dawn. The Hardys leapt from their horses and stretched their tired muscles and inhaled the fresh air deeply. They looked around and assessed their situation. "Well, there are Big Al's tracks," Joe said, pointing them out. Frank nodded. "Fairly fresh, too, but he could be a good distance ahead of us." "Any idea where we are, Frank?" "Not much, except we come clear through the mountain." Frank grinned wryly. "I'm famished, Joe. How about you?" "Same here. Think we can take time to eat?" "May as well," Frank decided. "No telling how long we'll be on the trail. Luckily, we didn't unpack." The boys fed their horses, built a small fire, and had breakfast. They then swung back into their saddles and resumed their pursuit of the outlaw. His tracks led upwards onto a beaten trail winding along the mountainside. When they reached the path, Frank reined in his mount and glanced towards a high, jutting rock formation further up the mountain. "Know something, Joe?" he remarked. "I'll bet this is a continuation of Ambush Trail." "You're right!" Joe snapped his fingers. "I remember seeing that rocky outcrop on away in the distance before I fell into the river." "If this is Ambush Trail," Frank went on, "Big Al must be heading for their hideout on Windy Peak." "Well, that figures," Joe agreed. "He thinks he's shaken us by going through the tunnel." The boys continued their pursuit through the morning. Around noontime, Big Al's tracks left the well-defined path and disappeared upward among the higher rocks and brush. "Good grief," Joe groaned at the sight. "How can we tackle that kind of ground when our horses are exhausted already?" Frank looked thoughtfully as they slouched in their saddles and studied the terrain. "Maybe there's no need to, Joe. I have a hunch this could be a dodge to throw us off." "You could be right," Joe said, brightening. "If Big Al's heading for Windy Peak, he'll probably have to come back to the trail eventually." After talking the matter over, the Hardys decided to halt for lunch and a rest. 2 hours later, feeling refreshed, they hit the trail again. It was late in the afternoon when the boys sighted the outlaw's tracks once more, heading from the slope back down onto the trail. "Your hunch paid off, Frank," Joe exclaimed. "Those tracks look pretty fresh, too." Encouraged, the boys pressed forward with new energy. A mile on, the trail forked. One branch struck sharply upward. The other followed a more winding course along the curve of the mountainside. To their left stretched a shallow box canyon. Frank and Joe looked the trail over, and since the prince of Big Al had gone that way, they took the lower trail. Gradually, the path became a little more than a rocky ledge, with frequent sharp turns and a sheer drop along the outer edge. The Hardys rode single file, with Joe in the lead. Suddenly, a pebble clattered down from a rock jutting just above their heads. Frank shot a quick glance upward. "Look out, Joe!" he yelled. A rope with a wide circling noose was snaking down towards his brother's head. Frank's warning came an instant too late. The noose settled over Joe's shoulders, jerked tight, nearly yanking him from the saddle. Frank spurred forward, white with terror. Someone hidden in the ledge above was trying to drop Joe over the precipice. Frank managed to grab the taut rope just in time. Almost at the same instant, the unseen enemy let go of it. Joe would have gone over the brink, but Frank's quick jerk on the rope pulled his brother back from the edge, and Joe dropped heavily onto the trail. Unhurt, he struggled to his feet and began extricating himself from the noose. In moments, he was free. "There goes the rat!" Frank yelled as a figure burst from the ledge above and scrambled rapidly along the slope. Big Al. Instantly, Joe was back in the saddle. The Hardys spurred forward in hot pursuit. The outlaw's course was roughly parallel to the trail. Suddenly, Big Al checked his stride long enough to send a large rock rumbling down the slope. "Hold it, Frank," Joe warned. Both boys yanked their horses into a rearing, whinnying halt in the nick of time. A split second later, the rock crashed onto the trail just ahead, rolling to the edge and went over. The animals snorted with fear and stood trembling. Frank and Joe barely managed to spur them on to motion again. Big Al was lost to view behind a clump of brush and jagged outcropping. The trail bent sharply around a projecting shoulder of the mountainside. Joe caught a quick glimpse of Big Al outlined against the sky as he rounded the slope. Then he disappeared. The boys slowed their mounts to negotiate the dangerous hairpin curve of the ledge. As they came around to the opposite side of the shoulder, Joe reined in and signaled Frank to halt. Ahead stood Big Al's riderless horse. The Hardys dismounted to scout the situation. Where has he gone?" Frank asked tensely. "Search me," Joe replied, looking around. Just past the outlaw's horse, the trail petered out, and the train sloped upward in a jumble of giant rocks. Beyond them, a huge boulder stood poised straight up like a pinnacle. "He must be holed up amongst those rocks," Frank said, "probably waiting for us." He had hardly finished speaking when Joe clutched his brother's arm and pointed. "Look! There he is!" Big Al had suddenly appeared, clawing his way to the very top of the jutting boulder. "He's trapped!" Frank cried out triumphantly. "Let's get him!"